Okay, so the film that I've brought Myroslava on the show today to talk about is Come and See by Elem Klimov. A great film that I'm sure you will agree.
I agree.
Cool.
No, I'm just, even you mentioning it is just sort of transporting me back to the well, John Rathall called it in his article on the film titled Excursion to Hell, called it an apocalypse firmly rooted in the real. So yeah, I was back in Nazi occupied Belarus of 1943 for a second there.
There's a very interesting quote online that I'm going to nick from the Wikipedia article on Come and See that I thought was incredible, and I can't believe someone's actually said this. I don't know if you've seen this before, but it was in Empire magazine, and it said that here we go. So, Elem Klimov's seriously influential, deeply unsettling Belarusian opus, no film, not Apocalypse Now, not Full Metal Jacket, spells out the dehumanizing impact of conflict more vividly or ferociously. An impressionist masterpiece, and possibly the worst date movie ever.
Oh, shebang.
So there you go. So even in
We've hit bullseye.
Empire knew that it's a very, very bad date movie. And as we go through the show, I'm sure you will all agree. But I don't want to go into Come and See right away. What I wanted to do is because my favourite type of war movie is the Soviet war movie. So this is a very, very specific type of movie that came out mostly in sort of the late 50s, early 60s, the 70s, and then Come and See, obviously in the 80s. So what I wanted to do is, before we talk about Come and See itself, I want to kind of give some kind of context to kind of where Come and See is in kind of the history and the evolution of the Soviet war movie. So what I wanted to ask you, Miro, first of all, is in the Soviet Union at the time, what you had was called the Great Patriotic War. So this is what to us in the West is World War Two, but it's not called World War Two where you are.
But the Great Patriotic War was the name given to the war by Soviet ideologists to reflect the colossal sacrifice that the Soviet troops, but also the Soviet population endured during the war, during the Nazi occupation. I mean, Come and See, shows us up close some of the atrocities that Soviet civilians endured and the very heavy losses. I mean, it's officially a figure of 20 million was given during the Soviet era to denote both civilian and military casualties. But now it's estimated that it's as high as 26 to 29 million. And that's that is a lot of people, and also Soviet ideology rested essentially on two great historic narratives or myths. The first one was the myth of the Russian Revolution as a mass popular revolution rather than a coup, which it was. And the second one was that of the heroic Soviet victory against the Nazi aggressor, mostly on the Eastern Front, but it tended to ignore the input of the Allies, as well as kind of edit the brutal reality of war, kind of focusing on heroism rather than on some of the atrocities that were committed, even by Soviet authorities against their own returning prisoners of war, for instance.
That's actually quite
Who,
interesting because I just had a
mm,
think about it when you said that, and yeah, you're right. They don't really refer to the war as a whole. It's only what was going on the Eastern Front at the time. It's almost like the rest of Europe didn't really matter.
well, I think it's natural for every country to have, to focus historically on its own participation. But yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, Ukraine, for instance, So what is now geographically independent Ukraine then would have been part of as many as four different countries, with Ukrainians, fighting at different parts during the Second World War, not just as part of the Soviet effort within the Great Patriotic War. So we're kind of moving towards a more inclusive narrative in Ukraine. In Russia, obviously, it's still very much about the Great Patriotic War, and there are many monuments. There are many sort of ceremonial aspects to kind of honoring the Soviet war dead, honoring the Soviet civilian casualties as well.
Yeah, which moves into kind of the actual films themselves. So
Absolutely.
in the Stalin era, we
Hmm.
have, well, obviously the Eisenstein films, which are not about World War Two, but he made obviously a couple of war films as Alexander Nevsky and obviously Battleship Potemkin.
Hmm.
So, but they are propaganda films, most definitely, but they are looked on much more fondly than other kind of war movies of the Stalin era, which are literally propaganda films but have, well, which are deemed as to having no artistic merit to speak of. Because most of them, I've got to be honest, I haven't actually heard of any of them. That's sort of how kind of little fanfare they have, really, so to speak.
That's true. I think it, the films that have artistic merit today, that are perceived as having artistic merit today, tend to come after the death of Stalin in 1953. So, for instance, we have The Cranes Are Flying from 1957. Yeah, essentially a melodrama set during the Second World War. Ballad of a Soldier in 1959, for instance, even though that refers to, yeah, that's not primarily a war film. That's also kind of focuses more on a story of friendship. So films that have a more personal narrative at the heart and with less focus on kind of the overview.
Yeah, so
Uh,
the only film that I thought had any merit, I don't know if it's not necessarily about World War Two because it was made before World War Two, but it was interestingly because it's by Alexander Dushenko, is Arsenal,
hmm. Oh
which is
yeah,
about
you
World
saw that
War One.
recently, didn't
Yes, I
you?
did. I watched that for this show. I was doing my research,
Of course.
which yeah actually has more war footage in it than I think most of the films of the period that you're talking about in the Khrushchev area. So, but again, it's more like you said, and this is the interesting thing about all these films is I don't know if it's due to budgetary reasons or if it's just the times they were made or because of Soviet censorship or what have you, but it's not necessarily, you're right, they're not necessarily about the actual soldiers on the front line fighting against the Nazis. They're about the soldiers or they're people who know soldiers, and it's about the effects back home, so to speak. And in terms of The Cranes Are Flying, you're right, it's a melodrama. It's not, that's obviously one of the characters involved is a soldier, but it's more about his, girlfriend who he
Yeah.
wants to marry and that she's, stuck at home while he's on the front line. They can't talk to each other or they try and talk to each other, but their communications don't get to each other, and there's this guy who she's living with who really likes her and things like
Who
that.
raped her?
Well, there you go. So yeah,
I'm sorry, was that a euphemism? He really likes her.
it's been a while since I've seen that film, so I think I just forgot. But yeah,
Yeah,
you're right.
yeah.
You've got Ballad of a Soldier, which it's about a soldier, admittedly, hence why it's got that name. But it's about a soldier who's on his way home from battle, and kind of all the different things that happen to him. And there's another film from this period by Sergei Bondarchuk called Fate of a Man, which I think is also called Destiny of a Man. I don't know if that's a
Hmm.
literal kind of translation, but again, it's about someone who is affected by the war because he's lost his wife uh, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think compared to a lot of other countries, I think every national cinema has its different sort of strata of war movies. But in Soviet cinema, war movies continued to be a genre, well into the Glasnost years. And Come and See is an example of a late Soviet movie that is a lot more expressionistic, a lot more experimental in its visual language, and a lot more controversial in the content that it shows and the sort of interpretation that it offers of the events that occurred. Um, the Soviet war film is one of the genres alongside the melodrama, the action film, the production film, the comedy film. It's there. It's there in the 50s, as we've discussed. It's there in the 60s. It's there in the 70s. It's there in the 80s. It's something that just never goes away, and a lot of that is for propaganda purposes. Keeping the Soviet sacrifice very much in the foreground of people's minds to show that, oh no, actually no, they do need the state to defeat this sort of danger that comes from a hostile regime. I mean, obviously, during after the Second World War, we had the Cold War. The ideological enemy shifted from Nazi Germany
Is
to,
that a directive from above? Because I mean, I would say all these films that they're obviously from the Soviet point of view. They're not
yeah.
as kind of blatantly propaganda films as the Stalinist films.
Oh no, sure. There was a lot of room for creative
Could they not
expression.
get these films made? Is kind of what I'm saying, unless they had
No,
that view.
no, because you couldn't get access to equipment or to funding. You had to be a member of the National Union of Filmmakers. You had to be an official registered director. Your script had to be approved. Your film had to be approved. I mean, there are cases of films being made and not, and being left for years on the census shelf because they didn't, conform to directives from above. And a lot of that was discretionary. A lot of that came from Soviet officials who were far from the creative process, and there was always this battle between sort of the creative arm and the official arm, so to speak. But of course, when you had someone like Elem Klimov who came very high up the Soviet film production food chain, didn't he?
He did in the end, yeah.
Mm.
After Come and See came out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, interesting you mentioned sort of directors who had trouble with the Soviet censors. Obviously, at this time, the I suppose one of I guess the top three most well known Soviet war movies is Ivan's Childhood by Andrei Tarkovsky, his first film, and a film very similar to Come and See in a lot of ways because the main character is a child. And interestingly, in this period, it's the only film that kind of takes place while the war's still going on. It's kind of on the front line, although you don't get any scenes of kind of soldiers fighting each other or anything like that. It is set during wartime, it's still going on. And it's very different in that it's very poetic and it's very
Mm.
lyrical in that
Mm-hmm.
sense. It's very, as I say, very early Tarkovsky hadn't found his signature style yet, but it's very different and it's way less melodramatic, I guess, than the other films at this time. And yeah, so very interesting counterpoint to Come and See.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Come and See has been compared to Ivan's Childhood quite a lot. Some say he pays homage to Tarkovsky in Come and See.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm going to talk about that when we come to
Mm.
talk about the film itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, you get the 70s period, which is under Brezhnev. And the difference now, and again, I don't know if this is just because censorship rules have changed or if it's just a more modern time or if the budgets were higher. But at this point, you get more films that are actually about soldiers on the front line during the war. So in the sort of early to mid 70s, you've got films like Trial on the Road by Alexei
Mm.
Kurman, The Dawn's Here Quiet, which is by Stanislav Rosatatsky. They Fought for Their Motherland by Sergei Bondarchuk again. He's a director of War and Peace. That one is, I haven't actually seen it, but it's a lot more kind of a typical war movie like you would probably get in America, where it's literally sort of a group of soldiers on the front line, actual battle scenes. It's kind of very kind of similar to something like Saving Private Ryan in that regard. Also, another film I haven't actually seen, but I heard about because I believe it's a Ukrainian film. It's called Only Old Men Are Going to Battle by Leonid Bykov.
Yeah, yeah. It's it's a good one. A lot more light-hearted.
Yeah, and also at this time, and this ties in a lot to come and see, is The Ascent by Larissa Shepitko. Larissa Shepitko was the late wife of Elem Klimov, which is probably my second favourite Soviet war movie of this period. And again, it's very, very kind of psychological, and it's, I suppose, along with Come and See and probably Apocalypse Now, it's probably one of the only war movies that's not literally about kind of soldiers fighting and kind of their camaraderie and stuff like that. It's actually about deep psychological, almost religious kind of symbolism.
I think we could probably do a whole separate podcast about The Ascent. I'm a huge fan of the film.
Yes, it's my favourite film art directed movie of all time. It's an amazing film.
It is. It is.
And just bring it up to the present day, I mean, I'm shocked at the sheer number of kind of war movies that still get made, even in Russia or the former
Oh yeah,
Soviet states today.
absolutely.
Some that I've looked up, some of which I've seen a little bit of, and they're in different parts of the former Soviet Union. So you've got a film called Fortress of War by
Hmm.
Alexander Kot, which I saw was all right. It's very kind of very typical sort of modern kind of war movie. That's a co-Russian Belarusian production. And then you've got a film called In the Fog by Sergei Lozhnitsa, who's a Ukrainian director. But the film itself, similar to The Ascent, is also based on a story by Vasil Bykov, which is
Hmm.
again a lot more about kind of soul. It's a lot more deeply kind of psychological, and as that's a co-production of various different countries, including Belarus and Russia. And on the other end of the scale, you've got stuff like Stalingrad by Fedor Bondarchuk.
Yeah, I was going to refer to that, which has some very contemporary visuals. I mean, a lot of CGI. It's sort of shot in a kind of very trendy way, almost in the style of a high budget music video.
Yeah, I've heard it's shot very similar to like 300, lots of slow mo,
Yeah, a lot of it, very stylized.
very, very heavily stylized. Uh, mm, yeah, I'm not sure I would probably enjoy that one. I also saw a film, it was on Amazon Prime. From a very similar time period again. It's called Battle for Sevastopol, which is a
Hmm.
co-Russian Ukrainian production. I guess almost like the Soviet kind of counterpoint to American Sniper. I guess is the
Yeah,
best way to describe that one.
well, it's significant that we have a lot of these contemporary Russian Belarusian co-productions, kind of almost bolstering the more traditional Soviet view of the Second World War, where a lot of the time the heroism of the Soviet soldiers goes unchallenged. There are very few kind of moral gray areas. You asked why it was that in the 70s Soviet war movies take on a more kind of action focus. It's probably because there is a need to show the events of the war to a younger generation who themselves did not go to war.
Yeah, that's very true. But by that point, it's at least 25 years sort of after the events.
Yeah, and obviously going to the cinema was very popular amongst Soviet citizens. People would There were quite a few films coming out all the time, and in practice, people would go and see everything that was showing. So this was a very important kind of bonding experience for families, and so you would have these multiple generations going to see war movies together, and quite often that would generate a discussion or reminiscences, or so it was both a reassuring but also kind of an ideologically motivated choice of the Soviet state to fund as many war movies as they did. at any one time you would have at least one new war film playing, but quite often you would have several.
That's still the case now because I've noticed there's
Mm.
films even this
Yeah.
year that have been released in Russia that are about World War Two. You'd think they would run out of kind of events in World War Two to kind of make films about. I mean, is this similar to the Stalin era where you think that Putin is kind of, I don't know, heading up sort of, it's like
I would
propaganda?
really caution you against making such, historic comparisons. Um, I think it's symptomatic of many countries that spent, decades in isolation from the world. In Ukraine, there is an upsurge of, you know, national, I mean, I don't want to say nationalistic, but let's say cinema that is funded by the state, that is designed to instill national pride in
Yeah, I would
in
say that's what
Ukrainian
movies like this are aimed to
film
do.
goers.
I guess
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
why you
yeah.
would make a war movie. That's why something like Saving Private Ryan exists.
There's a very curious film that is coming out in Ukraine soon. It's called X, and it's very odd. I saw a trailer for it. It is basically like, I think it's modeled on Peaky Blinders. It's a
Okay,
very strange thing. It's basic. I think it's set in the 1910s or 1920s, and it's basically set in Western Ukraine, and it's a gang of Western Ukrainian nationalists that are robbing banks in order to raise money for Ukraine's war of independence against the Poles.
right.
So it's interesting to see the kind of the focus shift from Russians to Poles, because obviously,
Those horrible
another
Poles.
former empire. But you saw this in Polish cinema in the early 2000s, and actually you see that even now with kind of added EU funding and generally bigger budgets. There was a lot of focus on producing films which raised a generation of proud Poles, and I saw a film called, I believe it's called Warsaw, and it was about the battle for Warsaw, a Polish film, which I actually saw in 3D, believe it or not.
Oh, same as
And it had,
Stalingrad.
yeah, yeah, and it was very much like that, very crisp, very modern, kind of flawless editing, but absolutely no nuance. Everyone was either very bad
Or very
or very
good.
good. You sort of had, there was this scene, I remember literally nothing of the film except a general impression. And there was this scene where a Polish, like a priest, a priest on the front line stands against an armada of tanks brandishing a crucifix, and you sort of see, you see his fist kind of trying to, I don't know what he's trying to do, but it's basically raising across to the sky as he's being crushed by a tank. It's sort of it's a very different flavor to something like Come and See, which
Yeah, it
uses
sounds it.
quite a range of visual means to convey the horror of war, but none of them are as in your face as that.
Yeah, yeah, we're not in kind of the moral complexity of something like The Ascent or
No,
Come and See.
not at all.
No, and that brings us very, very nicely, in fact, to the film that we're here to talk about in great detail today, which is Come and See. If you've not listened to one of these shows before, first of all, why haven't you? These are awesome. But I'm joking. The thing I kind of want to try and say at the start of all these shows is, if you have never seen Come and See before, we're going to be talking about the film in some great detail. So there's going to be many spoilers. Also, there may be some upsetting content in there. It's a very harrowing film in a lot of ways, as we're going to discuss. So you may be upset, but then again, if you're likely to be easily upset, why are you listening to a show called Worst Date Movies Ever? So that's on you, I'm afraid. In terms of kind of where Come and See is in the evolution, what I was going to say, and this kind of ties into all the previous sort of 15 or 20 minutes, is to me, it feels like a combination of the movies from the late 50s and Ivan's childhood. If we ignore Ivan's childhood, because that's kind of like a separate thing, what I find about the films from the 50s is it's about a series of characters and the war is going on and they are affected by the war. They are not directly affecting what's going on in the film, they are reacting to it. And whereas the 70s sort of Soviet war movies are about soldiers and they're on the front line, they are fighting the Nazis, and it's about how they interact with other soldiers, and there's all this stuff going on the front line. So Come and See, to me, is a combination of the two, because the main character is very, very much throughout the film affected by the events around him. He's not really, no, he has no effect on what's going on. He just is a bystander in a lot of ways to what is happening, but yet it is literally taking place on the front line. There are Belarusian soldiers, there are German soldiers, and things like that. So that's kind of how I think it ties in. It's kind of a mixture of the two.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. A lot of the horror comes from the fact that the protagonist, Flora, a village boy, is paralyzed with fear, with the inability to act, to do anything to counter what he is witnessing.
Yes, so Elem Klimov, he's the director of this film and the co-writer. This is by far his most well-known film. His other, I guess, fairly well-known film is a film called Welcome or No Trespassing, which is very, very different, as this a comedy satire, which is set in a summer camp, believe it or not. So that is sort of positively kind of fun and games compared to this film. The story of the film is based on a short story, which is called I Am from the Fiery Village, which is
Mm.
written by three people, but mainly who we're going to concentrate on is Alice Adamovich, who is the co-writer of Come and See. And the story is based on his observations and his experiences during World War II. Because this section of the war, one of the things that he said about this film is it's the most realistic, it's the most true to life, because it's based on things that actually happened. If anything, as horrific as a lot of the things are, there are things that happened in real life that are worse, they could not possibly include in the film, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
Absolutely.
Interesting point on the title of the film. So in English, the film is called Come and See. Now,
Yeah.
in Belarusian, the direct translation is Come and See, but in Russian, apparently it has a different title, that, as you have told me before.
So basically, the title is taken uh, from a passage in the Apocalypse of St. John, where, so let me just read out.
Yeah, sure.
So it's chapter 6, verses 7 to 8. And it's an invitation to look upon the destruction caused by the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, Come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth. So it's literally it's literally an apocalyptic reference.
Yeah, it's very evocative and it's very kind of true to what happens in the film.
Mm,
But
absolutely.
but interestingly, it's not what Klemov actually wanted to call the film initially. He apparently, well, according to him in an interview that I saw earlier today, he originally wanted to call the film Kill Hitler,
Yeah,
which,
which refers to the
yeah,
final scene
it
of the
does.
film.
Yeah, so it refers to the most famous scene in the film, which is not literally right at the end of the film, but is basically right near the end of the film, where the main character effectively kills Hitler over and over and over and over again. It's not literally, I mean, you could take the title as incredibly kind of reductionist, as, oh, kill Hitler, Hitler's well bad in it. But no, that's not actually what the title means. But apparently the censors wouldn't allow him to call the film that because they didn't think it should refer to Hitler as literally as it does. So hence why the film is called Come and See.
Well, if I remember correctly, what happens is so Flora is holding a rifle and he's in a near a puddle where there is a photograph of Hitler with some Belarusian writing on it. So these were kind of propaganda materials that were distributed um, around all the occupied territories. And he's shooting at the portrait, and as he is shooting at the photograph of Hitler, we are shown documentary footage, so actual historical footage, which is built into the film, and it's been shown in reverse. So we basically see Hitler's rise to power and to war in reverse all the way back until we see a photo of Hitler as a child. And it is then that Flora is unable to shoot at it again, when he sees that Hitler too was a child many, many years ago, just like he was until recently.
Yeah,
And he
so yeah.
stops and he doesn't shoot, and that sort of shows that humanity in him has not been completely erased.
No, although well, by the end of the film, you wouldn't really blame him. But yes, the point is that at one point Hitler was a child, and at some point, maybe like the things like this could have happened to him to end up in the situation where he is. So maybe Floria could end up being the new Hitler at some point. You know, if he
Mm.
carries on as he goes. Cool. So Miro. So, what is the story of Come and See?
So Come and See shows us a day in the life of Flora, or which is short for Florian, a Belarusian village boy in the midst of a Nazi reprisal operation against the civilian population. So what Nazi reprisals were, for instance, if one of the partisans or freedom fighters kills a Nazi soldier or Nazi officer, God forbid, an SS battalion would go into that village and basically burn the whole village to the ground to set an example that the Nazi occupation was, was undisputed, was untouchable. And so this boy, he leaves his mother and his younger siblings to join the partisans in the forest, which he thinks will be an exciting adventure. His mother begs him not to go. He leaves. In that time, the Nazis come, completely slaughter everyone. But he sort of enjoys a brief moment of respite when he meets a beautiful girl who's in love with the commander of the partisan group, Glasha. And there's a kind of very strange scene, which I think the scene where it's raining in the forest and they're sort of running around like shouting like mad, it just have a kind of, it's like an unsettled Tarkovsky, wouldn't you say? It's like a mad Tarkovsky.
Yeah, that scene is definitely very, very Tarkovsky influenced, or it's very, very
Mm.
similar to something that he would do because of the way it's done. Because you've got it suddenly rains, and then you've got the birds. Now, one of the things I was going to say is that birds appear quite a lot in this film. There's a lot of bird related imagery. So you've got, I believe it's a heron that appears
Mm-hmm.
in the scene you're talking about. The
Mm-hmm.
scene where Floria goes back to his mother's house, and his mother and his sisters aren't there, and then he looks down a well. On the well is a bird. There's bird sound on the score during a lot of the more harrowing scenes. It's part of the layers of sound that take
Mm-hmm.
place. And there's a couple of other scenes where birds appear or there is
Hmm.
sort of there's yeah, they appear in the film in a few different places. It's kind of almost very Terrence Malick esque.
Okay, that's interesting. That's honestly not something that I picked up on.
I'm sure there is
But
some kind of visual symbolism there. I'm not good with symbolism normally, but it was too kind of, I don't know, it's kind of too blatant not to notice.
yeah, absolutely. Well, it is set in the country, so there's a lot of kind of folk customs and superstitions to do with birds. Like if you hear this bird sing, it means that, etc. So it's quite possible. I haven't read I didn't read the story that this is based on, but it may well be that that's a trope in the story as well.
They're very evocative
So
images nonetheless, though.
absolutely. Um, one of the key scenes in the film is obviously when practically the remaining population of the village is herded into a barn, which is set on fire by the Nazis. And I think that is definitely a scene that Spielberg um, drew on.
Yeah, that was definitely drawn on when he made Schindler's List, because there's a scene that's
Yeah,
practically very similar to it. It's not involve fire, but it does involve like Jews being herded and into a single building.
yeah,
I
yeah, and
believe they use it in something very similar in Son of Saul as well, which is a Hungarian war film that came out a couple of years ago. Again, it's not involving sort of people being set on fire; it's more people being gassed. But again, it's sort of the scene of kind of groups of sort of men, women, and children all being put in a single location, and you can really feel the claustrophobia and the
yeah.
sense of what the fuck is going to happen, and we're scared for our lives type thing.
Well, this is something that happened again and again, hundreds, even thousands of times, all across the occupied territories. So yeah, although this is showing, one case, the understanding is that this was happening not just once, but many, many times. There's also an episode in The Reader, both the film and the book, the Schilderdink book that it was based on, where Kate Winslet's character, who was a guard in a concentration camp, basically does the same to a group of Jewish prisoners, which is then what she is tried for. So it's something that happened again and again.
One of the things, well, that's immediately obvious. So the start of the film. So I really like sort of the way the film looks. So one of the things that I found really awesome about the film is, I believe about 95% of the film is set outside. So kind
Mm,
of prominent colors on in the film are like green and brown, and so yeah, very earthy, very natural colors. And yeah, which again sort of makes it stand out, because I think a lot of films they kind of have to take place inside because they've set up sets, or because maybe it's easier to shoot.
And
Um,
also a lot of war films, a lot of Soviet, well, most Soviet war films are black and white, aren't they?
Whereas this one's in color, which is
But
very
it's
interesting.
1985, so it's a lot later. Which is it's not just in the color, it's not just the color of it. It's also the way that it's edited.
Yeah, the editing in this is awesome, and I love the camera work. So the camera work is very similarly to The Ascent by Larissa
Mm,
Shepitko. It involves a lot of face close-ups. So particularly, I think my second favourite, or possibly even my favourite section of the film, is between Floria and Glacia, where
hmm.
most of it is their faces are in the centre of the frame, and they're basically looking at the camera while they're talking to each other. That's sort of a very hypnotic scene where you've got them basically staring at each other, talking to each other, and they have these very strange conversations that don't really make sense if you were taking them literally. But they kind of feed into this sort of hypnotic kind of strange, I guess Tarkovsky like kind of feel that those sections are going for. I thought, because I've actually seen this film about 4 or 5 times now, and there's sort of little things that you kind of notice when you're kind of watching the film. In a way, I felt that like Glacia, she is a real person. It's like she is there, but she's almost got this like supernatural presence. Because when she
Mm.
first appears in the film, she appears kind of almost like far away, and no one acknowledges her apart from the leader of the partisans and Floria. Everyone else doesn't really pay any attention to her, as if she's like a ghost or a spirit.
Yeah, that's true. I think also her role in this is to show that Flora experiences the entire spectrum of human emotions in the space of 24 hours because he falls in love, he's fascinated. She mocks him. She is beautiful. She is older than him. She's sort of graceful. She's also in love with basically the alpha male of the Belarusian partisan
It's
resistance.
always the way it goes, isn't it?
Absolutely. So he watches her with fascination and trepidation. And it is through his eyes that we see everything that we see. So if we compare, yeah, the sort of heightened emotional state in which we are shown um, the first meeting with Glasha, to the sheer detachment and the sheer kind of emotional, it's not even apathy, it's almost the inadequacy of emotion in the scene where the peasants are burnt in a barn. It shows us that he has exhausted he's exhausted everything, his all his feelings.
Yeah, and as well, around this time, what I really like in those scenes is kind of the dreamlike feel of them. So you mentioned obviously they're very Tarkovsky like. It's got that very almost very poetic, almost surreal feel that a lot of
Mm.
Tarkovsky's films have. So I'm particularly thinking of like Nostalgia, or even like
Mm-hmm.
the end of Stalker, for example, and things like that. It kind of just reminded me of that to me.
And a lot of that is a scene that kind of the edges blur between the natural world and the human world.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm. Solaris as well is another example.
Yeah, most of Tarkovsky's films, in fact, and Mirror. I mean, fuck, like there's
Mirror.
scenes in Mirror that are like amazingly like that. Like the scene where the it's like a shed that's burning in the distance, or where the water is evaporating and you kind of see it happen. It's like what's it called? Where real life is sped up. I assume that's how he did it.
Mm.
But yeah, that scenes like that, just so they're not like it's not like CGI kind of weird stuff. It's the real world, but it's used in like a lyrical kind of way. It's very, very awesome.
Yeah, it's visual poetry.
Yes,
It's basically something
exactly.
which
That's what I was
which
thinking of. That's why you're here. You're here to carry me. Kind of remember things like that, little terms that I can never remember.
I'm here to pepper your hard work and research with a few flourishes here and there.
Exactly,
Absolutely.
exactly. You're here to carry me on this show. Also, I mean, other bird things that I've seen in my notes. Near the beginning of the film, where Floria is basically being taken away by the two partisans, and his mother's sort of trying to tell them, "Why are you doing this?" Like he's just a young boy. Yeah, there are birds in the house pecking at crumbs on the floor. And when Floria goes into the forest, he accidentally steps on some bird eggs as well. So that's more kind of bird imagery in there. Weirdly, compared to a lot of other war films, apart from this partisan leader, and there's another kind of partisan character who's fairly prominent in the middle of the film, all the soldiers aren't really kind of given any kind of center stage, which kind of, I guess, ties into kind of that they're not really the center of the story. It's Floria's story, so it's set during the war, but it's about the war's effect on him. That's kind of the central story. And yeah, I found that quite interesting compared to something like The Dawns Here Are Quiet. or Trial on the
Yeah.
Road, or well, pretty much any kind of war film where generally you're on the front line, you've got your leader, and you've got probably a second in command, and you've got all the privates and stuff like that, and it's kind of them kind of brothers in arms. It's sort of very,
Or
very
sisters in
atypical.
arms, if you're referring to The Dawns Are Quiet here.
Okay, brothers and sisters in arms. It's not really that kind of film. So yeah, the partisans, even the Nazis, for the most part, they're very kind of dehumanized, which I thought was
Yeah.
different.
Also, the heightened aestheticism of the way the SS battalion is shown. Like you've got the female Nazi officer eating lobster.
Yes.
She's and the sort of meticulous detail that is shown. You've got the Nazi officer with
So Loris.
he's got a pet loris, yeah, and just kind of just sheer indulgence, the sheer kind of decadence of it. He's in the middle of a Belarusian forest with this e- exotic pet, like there's no function to it. So he's comfortable enough to be petting this sort of outlandish creature.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, just the cruelty of it, the coldness of their expressions.
Yeah, I suppose kind of going to that section of the film, I mean that's kind of the center point of the film, because that whole section takes about half an hour, but it doesn't feel like half an hour at all.
It's
It's
so tense.
Yeah, it's this montage of images. There isn't really any dialogue. It's mostly shouting, and you've got dogs barking, and you've got the radio, which I think really
Mm.
adds a lot, because the I've got to say the sound design in this film is absolutely amazing. So scenes like that, and another scene that I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is the scene in the mud bog, where
Oh God.
you've got the sound of the score itself, and then so in this scene, for example, you've got all the human voices, and then you've got animal kind of sounds which are on top, which are non-diegetic for the most part, and then you have the classical music as well on top of that. So what you have is you have this very disorientating effect of this, yeah, just this wall of sound during a lot of
Mm.
these, and it works so well.
Hmm.
It's just the great use of music, and just yeah, in the film, it's just yeah, it's absolutely amazing.
It is, and Mozart's Lacrimosa, Mozart's Requiem, in the scene where Flora is shooting a photograph of Hitler. It's very powerful. I mean, the kind of the choral uh, chorus is it's such a it's a device that is used in so many films.
Mm.
When the choirs, when you have the choirs just suddenly um, just coming in. But in this film, it's so powerful.
Yeah, and as you've mentioned during this scene is a scene where you've got the villagers and they're all rounded up and thrown into this building to be set on fire, and so apparently in real life, sometimes what they would do is they would say, okay, the men have to stay and the children are allowed to leave. But in this case, what they said is like the men are allowed to leave and the women and children have to stay. And I think a man tries to leave and he gets shot in the window. And Floyer is interestingly allowed to leave. He manages to leave without getting shot, which I thought was quite interesting. And there's a woman who tries to escape, but then she gets captured and taken away and is presumably raped, although that takes place off screen.
Mm.
And she appears later on. It's her, and she's got the blood down her legs, and she looks like she's in almost like a catatonic state. This is after the Nazis have gone.
Mm.
Yeah, it's almost like the effect of almost like a circus coming into town. It's got that kind of effect. It's very very disorientating. We've got all these people, and yeah, it's I almost feel like I can't really do it justice, even if I talked about this for like 30 minutes or an hour just about this one section. Just the way it's done is just unbelievable. But as horrifying as it is, one thing I would say is that it's not gratuitous. Like, you have, yes, this building being set on fire, and we know that in the story, obviously, there are all these people in the building, but it's not like you literally see them on fire. This is not, SS Experiment Camp, or a film like that where you literally would see people burn, and you don't see, there are women taken away, and clearly they are being raped by multiple kind of Nazi soldiers, but you don't see it, but that's clearly what's happening.
Yeah, that's it is very it is that there is a sense of a frenetic sense of almost like a carnival of death is the expression that you sometimes see in the literature.
Also, during the film, one thing that I really like, and it comes up about 4 or 5 times, is there's a plane that flies overhead at different points during the film, and it literally happens in like the first 2 minutes of the film. And when that happens, there's this sort of drone sound on the score, and that comes in, I think, during this section as well, on top of the million other things that are going on. And yeah, it has a really awesome effect.
So according to Wikipedia, it's a Fokker Wolf FW189 Uhu. It's a it's a twin-engine, twin-boom, three-seat tactical reconnaissance and army cooperation aircraft, which was flying above all the time when they were shooting the film, because he wanted that to be part of the Dianetic sound.
Yeah, it works really well. It works really
Mm.
well, definitely. And it also comes in to my second favourite part of the film, an incredibly intense section of the film, which is the scene that I kind of mentioned already, where Floyd's gone back to his mother's house. Mother and his sisters aren't there. There's flies everywhere. You can hear flies really, really prominently on the soundtrack. And there's like dead dolls on the floor, broken dolls, I should say, dead dolls. They were alive, and the Nazis shot them, the bastards. No, and he, whether he knows but he doesn't know in inverted commas, or he just suspects, but he's just in denial about what's going on. He just assumes, well, my family, they've gone to an island, and then
Mm.
him and Glasha run off, and then Glasha turns around, sees all these dead bodies on the edge side of his house, or maybe another house. It's not really clear. And then it gets to the scene where they go through the mud bog, which is very similar to a scene in The Doors Here Are Quiet.
Oh God, yeah, that seriously, that scene. I remember seeing it on TV as a child. It absolutely horrified me. The sort of scene where a female soldier is walking through a, a woodland bog, and it sort of slowly sucks her in. I just thought that was just the worst thing ever. Used to have
Yeah, well,
nightmares about it. Well, apparently, the final episode, or actually was the penultimate episode of Game of Thrones, the scene where sort of Arya wanders through a completely destroyed King's Landing is has been said to be an allusion to Come and See
oh, there you go.
in the framing and in her expression and even in the sort of makeup that they use on her and the tone. Yeah, it's said to be referring to this.
So either the writer or the director would have seen this film and kind of gone, let's use that. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just after the scene in the mud bog, there's another very, very harrowing scene which takes place where Floria and Glasha have found the other villagers. And I really like this scene. It does remind me of, and I'm going to invoke this again, it does kind of remind me almost of like the way that the villagers are almost chanting, because I think it's mostly women. I assume all the men would be fighting, so it's mostly the women of the
It's a,
village.
I think you refer to it as shamanic scene.
Yeah, it's very shamanic, almost tribal like. So there's a scene
Mm.
in Cannibal Holocaust in the first, I don't know, half hour, 45 minutes of the film where the tribe are kind of all sat around, and Dr. Monroe, Professor Monroe rather, is basically recording them kind of chanting. It's this tribal ceremony. It's not, it's not happy. It's a drone. Again a droning kind of cacophony of noise.
Well, it's a ceremony that's it's largely improvised, isn't it? And it's
Mm,
born out of a kind of collective despair. So these terrified villagers make an effigy of Hitler out of mud that they put onto a human skull dressed
yeah.
in a Nazi soldier's uniform. So you can only imagine where that came from.
Well,
Probably a dead Nazi
dead
soldier.
Nazi, I would imagine.
Absolutely. There's quite a lot of this stuff, like even in the UK. So, for example, I went a couple of years ago to the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Boswell in Cornwall, and they have like a pin doll of Hitler that like British school children would have played with during the Second World War. So like evacuated school children would have had these like pin dolls of Hitler that they would have stuck needles in an attempt to alter the course of the war. So it's quite a common trope. I mean, in a sense, him shooting at the photograph of Hitler is a similar kind of transference, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I suppose you could see it like that. I mean, when we've talked about this film before, off air, you mentioned that this felt very. You mentioned that it's had like an occult vibe.
Well, yeah, absolutely, because it feels as though they are trying to alter the course of events in the only means available to them,
Mm.
namely by sort of sympathetic magic.
Yeah, it does feel sort of very, very magical. Like they're trying to invoke this evil spirit of Hitler to sort of they're trying to almost kill Hitler in that way. Again, kind of going back to sort of the title or the previous title of the film.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then after that, one of the last things I kind of wanted to talk about is tie. I don't know if this is deliberate. I assume it was to tie it into the ascent. After this section, there's a shot of the moon.
Yeah, of course. I almost wonder if Klimov pays, homage to Larissa Shepitko in choosing to show the moon in the same kind of close up way that she does in the ascent.
It would be a very subtle way to do that, I would say.
But of course, in the ascent, it's a full winter moon, isn't it? Wow, that sounds like a sounds
It's
like
a
an
black metal
immortal
album.
song.
It's an immortal album.
It is an immortal album. But this is a summer moon,
Diabolical full moon mysticism.
exactly. Um, yeah, I'm just thinking, but this is set in summer, and I wondered, like, is it more or less terrifying the fact that all of this stuff is happening in high summer rather than
Is
in the
it?
dead of winter?
Mm, well, I guess. I mean, the fact is, in high summer, I mean, it would just mean that I suppose when you've got snow, I guess snow is like an additional element. So in the ascent, for example, because that's taking place in the dead of the snow is kind of important because the parties and soldiers are kind of fighting against the elements as well, and then this other stuff happens on top of
Well,
that.
the cast nearly died. I mean, the cast and crew nearly died filming the first like 10 minutes of the film. I mean, Larissa Shepitko was down for 2 days with fever because of, they were filming for hours in the snow, trying to get it right. And they had
And they all got like hypothermia and frostbite, didn't
yeah,
they?
yeah, absolutely unsimulated shooting for hours. I think so the main actor, I forget his name, he had like two body doubles that they were using. And so once one person would get covered in snow, they would get the next one to stand in for them. And they were legitimately struggling because they were filming in a blizzard. So,
Wow. And like Leonardo DiCaprio gets an Oscar for like The Revenant because it's like, well, he had to climb into like an animal, and he had to like live in like very freezing cold temperatures.
wait,
So,
did
but
he actually?
well, apparently they did. Like they tried to do it almost as method as possible, didn't they? But not. My point is not to this extent. They didn't almost die.
No, I mean, the cast of The Dawns Are Quiet Here, because that was being shot in the summer in a forest in Karelia, which is a region in Russia that borders on Finland. So the water, so they're swimming a lot in that film. The water is like 5 degrees,
Yeah, that's fucking cold.
and and they had a lot of encephalitic uh, ticks in the forests. So the crew were covered in protective clothing, but the cast weren't. They're just wearing their like t-shirts and whatnot. So health and safety is not what it is in Hollywood when it comes
No,
to
certainly not.
Soviet
I
war
mean,
films. Both
no,
cast and crew are pretty much disposable.
no. I mean that's not. That's more than apparent during a scene. It's the only scene that I haven't really mentioned in the film. So it's the scene I kind of referred to earlier with Floria and the cow. So Floria's trying to steal this cow, and then there are bullets kind of flying over both of them, which are presumably from the Nazis. Now apparently these were real bullets. They did not use blanks. So, the actor Alexei Kravchenko, he mentioned in interviews that these bullets are literally flying about 4 inches above his head. He could actually have been shot and died kind of while making this film. So, yeah, again, not really keen on health and safety in the Soviet film industry in this point. Also, not really that keen on animal rights, unfortunately, because the cow, I believe, actually died
Yeah, that
in the
doesn't
film.
surprise me. I mean, when Bondarchuk filmed War and Peace, they actually set horses on fire, which I find it very hard to get past that in my mind.
There's it's very, very subtle, but kind of near the end of this film, sort of after the Nazis have left the village and they've set it on fire, and you see kind of Floria, and there's a female Nazi officer who's dying, and he kind of
Hmm.
takes a bandage so he can bandage up his rifle. As the Nazis are kind of leaving, you do actually see a horse kind of writhing around, kind of on the ground. I don't know if the horse was actually dying at that point, or if it's just been made to look like it is. But it's very convincing if it was in fact not real, which probably was at this point.
And these are just some of the things I come and see as the worst date movie ever.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's pretty harrowing stuff. I mean, not only is it based on real life events and it's I'm not saying it's like a documentary or anything, but they were very, very true to life. Again, not that the film is gory, although it does have gore in it, and not that the film is gratuitous or exploitative, because it really isn't. But just the effect of everything that we've talked about on this show today, as I say, just the again, just the way the editing, the shot composition, sort of the different shot types, and just the effect of the amazing score, and just the sound design in general. So the music in this film is composed by Oleg Yanchenko, and it's just amazing. It's just incredible.
Hmm.
Like I mentioned, use of like actual kind of classical music and his own sort of droning score. Uh, yeah, cow dying, um, various harrowing scenes of villagers sort of dead or in the process of dying or mourning, child going through like actual kind of harrowing kind of situations, and what, yeah, just very intense film, very intense film. Oh yeah, and at the end there is like actual footage I think that's taken from a concentration camp. So yeah, there is that as well. Let's not forget that. Yeah. So a very, very bad date movie, but still a great movie and one that's worth seeing. I think we both agree.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if you want to buy this film on DVD, you have many, many options. So the version I own, because it's one of my favourite films of all time, so obviously I own it on DVD, is from Nouveau Pictures, but that is a Region 2. If you live in America, you can buy it on Region 1 from Kino Video. Or if you live anywhere else, there's the Russian Special Edition, which you can buy, and that's a 2 disc. But yeah, wherever you live in the world, a film very, very much kind of worth owning on DVD. I think we should both agree. So I want to thank Myroslava Hartmond for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me again. This is our fourth episode together, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely. I should definitely have to get you on again sometime. Is there anything that you want to plug before we go?
So on the 3rd of December, we are launching our fourth charity art niche at the Triptych Gallery. So we're going to have 20 lots. 5 are presented by the gallery, 15 are donated by artists. They're priced at basically between 50 and about £300. Paintings, photographs, graphic art, collages, even sculpture, and 100% of proceeds go towards helping internally displaced children with cerebral palsy. So we're hoping to do as well as we did last time when we sold all 20 lots.
Yeah, yeah. So very, very worthwhile cause there. Yeah, if you want to get involved, obviously you can contact Miroslava on her social media.
Yeah, so I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. I am also on Twitter technically, but I'm not an active tweeter.
This is probably for the best because Twitter is a fucking cesspool, in my opinion. I hate it so much. But oh well, one must do what I have to do. Thank you very much for finally, Miroslava, for appearing on the show. I want to thank you all very, very much for listening. It's been a wonderful show. I hope you all agree. And I'll see you on the next show for more of the worst date movies ever.